The key her brother handed her was small enough to lose. An old brass thing gone dark at the edges from 60 years of nothing, and Russell set it down on the lawyer's table the way a man sets down a tool he is finished with. "That's Grandpa's old saddle shop," he said. "Building and the corner lot both. Figured you'd want it. You always were the sentimental one." The papers around the table were already signed. The home place, the house Asa Vance had built with his own hands and the 10 acres under it, had gone to Russell. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The grazing ground out along Cottonwood Creek, and the cattle that ran on it, had gone to Dean. What money their father had kept in the bank, which was not much, had been split into two halves that somehow did not include her. And Della Vance, 58 years old, 3 hours drive from the rented room she had to be out of by the first of the month, was being handed a padlocked building that had not had its door opened since 1957, before she was born. She turned the key over in her fingers. It was warm from her own hand and cold underneath, the way old metal is. Across the table, Dean would not look at her. Russell was already shuffling the next set of pages toward the lawyer, a man named Coyle who handled half the wills in the county and had the tired courtesy of someone who had watched a great many families divide themselves up in his front room. Della understood the shape of what was happening. She had understood it since she'd driven up for the funeral and found her brothers already moving through the house like men taking inventory of their own. She had been gone a long time. She had married badly, divorced worse, and spent the better part of 30 years 200 miles south, mending other people's furniture and taking in alterations, sewing linings back into coats, and recovering chairs for people who paid late. She did not have the standing to fight. She did not, that afternoon, have the heart for it. So when Russell slid the deed to the shop across the table and told her where to sign, she signed. The shop was hers. A building full of rotted leather and rusted tools, on a half-acre nobody had walked in decades, was the whole of what her father's estate had seen fit to leave her. She put the brass key in her coat pocket, and she did not let either of her brothers watch her face. To understand what that shop was, and what it had been, you have to go back to the man who built it. Asa Vance came to Hadley in the early part of the century with a leather apron, a roll of patterns, and a reputation that had not yet caught up to him. He was a saddle maker, not the kind who nailed a tree together and slapped some skirting on it for the cheapest dollar he could get. He was the kind they came 200 miles to find. In the high desert country of northern Nevada in those years, a working saddle was not an ornament. A buckaroo lived in his saddle 16 hours a day, and a bad one could ruin a horse's back and a man's hips in a single season. A good one could last him 40 years and outlive him. Asa Vance made the kind that outlived the men who rode them. He built his shop on the corner lot at the edge of town, a low-frame building with a tin roof and a south window. He had set himself so the afternoon light would fall across his bench. For 30 years that window glowed yellow into the evening while the rest of Hadley went dark. He hand-cut every tree, stretched the rawhide green and let it dry to iron, and tooled the leather with a swivel knife and a set of stamps he had made himself, because the ones you could buy never did exactly what he wanted. Ranchers from 3 states knew his mark. A. Vance, Hadley NEV, pressed small into the near jockey where a man's thumb would rub it smooth over the years. Buckaroos saved 2 seasons' wages for one of his saddles and considered it a bargain. Della knew all this the way a child knows things, which is to say she had absorbed it before she had words for it. She had been born late in the family, after her brothers, and by the time she was old enough to walk to town on her own, the shop had already been shut. But Asa was still alive then, an old man by the wood stove with hands going stiff and crooked, and Della was the only one of the 3 children who would sit with him. Her brothers had no patience for it. They wanted to be out with the stock, out with their father, doing the things that the men of the family did. Della would climb up beside the old man, and he would take a scrap of leather and a stamp and show her how to set it true, how a thing made well sat different in the hand than a thing made fast. She still remembered the smell of him, neat's food oil and pipe smoke and the particular dry sweetness of cut hide. She remembered, too, the thing he said to her more than once, near the end, when the family had stopped listening to him the way families do with the old. He would tap the side of his nose and look at her sideways and say, "You're the one that looks close, girl. The rest of them, they only ever see a thing from the road." The shop had closed in 1957. Della had grown up with the story, but never the whole of it. Only the parts the family found comfortable to tell. The trade was dying, they said, which was true. After the war, the ranches were buying factory saddles cheap out of catalogs, machine-stitched and stamped in a pattern that looked like tooling if you did not look close, and the young men did not know the difference and did not care to learn it. A drummer had come through in the spring of that year selling exactly that, and half the county had put in orders, and Asa had stood in his doorway and watched it happen. That was the part they told. The part they did not tell, the part Della only understood much later, was about her father. Vernon Vance was Asa's only son, and Asa had built the shop expecting it would be his someday. He had been training the boy at the bench since Vernon was 9. But Vernon had no feel for it and no love for it. And what he loved instead was cattle and money and the kind of standing in the county that came from owning ground rather than working leather. In the spring of 1957, the same spring the drummer came through, Vernon told his father he was done. He was going to run cattle. He was going to buy ground along the creek and lease more, and he was not going to spend his life bent over a bench going blind for $50 a saddle while the world bought its rigs from a catalog. Asa did not argue with him. That was not Asa's way. But something went out of the old man that spring, and a few weeks later he locked the shop door, boarded the south window from the inside, and never opened it again. He did not sell the trees or the tools. He did not break up the patterns. He did not let a single thing go for parts. He simply shut the door on his life's work, all of it, and walked away, and in the 27 years he had left he never spoke of it again except to a granddaughter who was not yet born when the door closed. Vernon got his cattle and his ground. He prospered, in the modest way a man prospered out there. He raised 3 children and buried a wife and grew old and hard and tight-fisted, and he never once, in all those years, turned the key in his father's shop. It sat on its corner lot like a thing nobody could quite bring themselves to look at. The town stopped seeing it. The young people in Hadley did not know there had ever been a saddle maker, and when Vernon died that spring at 91, the shop was so far out of everyone's mind that it nearly did not make it into the estate at all. Coyle the lawyer had to add it as a line item after the fact. The building and the half-acre, valued at almost nothing, taxes a few dollars a year. Nobody wanted it. So they gave it to Della and felt, in giving it, that they had been generous. She drove out to it on a cold, bright morning in the second week after the funeral, with the brass key in her coat pocket and a flashlight she'd bought at the hardware store, because she did not expect there to be power. The shop sat where it had always sat, at the end of a dirt track off the county road, with the creek running behind it through a stand of bare cottonwoods. The tin roof had gone to rust the color of old blood. The boards had silvered. Sagebrush had grown up around the foundation, and a tangle of dead cheatgrass leaned against the north wall. From the road, it was exactly what her brothers thought it was. A ruin. A thing to be torn down for the lumber, if the lumber was even any good. Della stood in front of it for a while before she went in. The wind came down off the desert behind the cottonwoods and moved the dry grass and made the only sound there was. She thought about her father, who had owned this building for 40 years and never once opened it, and about her grandfather, who had loved it so much he had sealed it like a tomb rather than watch it taken apart. She thought about being the sentimental one. Then she went to the door. The padlock was a heavy old brass affair, gone green, and for a moment she thought the key would never turn it. She worked it back and forth and felt the wards catch and finally give, all at once, with a sound like a small bone breaking. The hasp swung free. The door had swelled in its frame over the decades, and she had to put her shoulder to it twice before it scraped open across the floor, and then the inside breathed out at her, 60 years of held air, and she stood in the doorway and did not move. The smell came first. Even after all that time, even through the dust, it was unmistakable. Leather and oil and the dry sweetness of it, and under that the cold mineral smell of a place that had not been warmed by a fire in a lifetime. It was the smell of her grandfather. It hit her so hard and so suddenly that she had to put her hand against the doorframe. When her eyes adjusted, she began to see the room. It was not a ruin inside. That was the first thing, the thing that stopped her. Outside, the building was 60 years of weather and neglect. Inside, it was a workshop somebody had closed up at the end of a working day and meant to come back to in the morning. The bench ran along the boarded south wall, a great slab of a thing scarred and oil-darkened, and above it the tools hung on their pegs in perfect order. Round knives and head knives, their blades gone dark but unbroken. Edge tools and creasers. A whole rack of stamps, dozens of them, each one in its place. All's in a wooden block, their points dulled by air but still set in rows. A swivel knife laid down across a half-finished piece of leather as though the hand that held it had set it there an hour ago and stepped out for coffee. And along the far wall, on a row of wooden saddle racks Asa had built into the framing, under sheets of muslin gone gray with dust, were the saddles. Della counted them as she crossed the room. The floor groaned under her. 11 racks, and on every one of them a shape. And she reached up and took the corner of the nearest muslin sheet and drew it back slow, and the dust came off in a soft gray fall through the light. It was a saddle the like of which she had not seen in 30 years and maybe had never seen at all. A buckaroo rig, slick-forked, with a tall straight cantle and a post horn wrapped in rawhide so fine the braid was even as machine work and was not machine work, was a man's patient hands over long winter evenings. The leather was tooled across every surface a knife could reach, a full sheet of flowers and scrollwork running edge to edge, so deep and so clean that even under the dust it caught the light and held it. The conchos were silver, real silver, gone black with tarnish, but unmistakable. Down each side hung tapaderos, leather stirrup covers cut and tooled to match, the kind of thing a working man asked for only when he meant the saddle to last him the rest of his life. Della had spent 30 years with her hands on leather and cloth and joinery. She knew handwork the way her brothers knew cattle. She knew what it cost in hours and in skill and in the particular stubbornness of a person who would not let a thing leave the bench until it was right. She ran her fingers down the tooled fender and felt the cut of it, sharp and sure, and not one stamp out of place across a surface that must have taken him 100 hours, and she understood, standing there in the cold and the dust, that she was not looking at junk. She went down the row and uncovered them one by one. 11 saddles. No two alike. Some plainer, working rigs meant to be ridden, though even the plainest of them was finer than anything you could buy now at any price. Some so heavily carved and silver-mounted they could only have been made to be looked at, a maker showing the full reach of what his hands could do. They were all of them perfect. 60 years sealed in the dry desert air had kept them. The leather wanted oil and the silver wanted cleaning, but there was no rot, no mouse damage, no cracking. Asa had built the shop tight and shut it tighter, and time had simply stopped inside it. There was a 12th saddle, and it was not finished. It sat on a tree at the end of the bench, the bare wood and rawhide showing through where the leather had not yet been fitted, the skirts cut and oiled and laid ready, but not yet on. Beside it on the bench was a roll of patterns and a tracing in pencil on butcher paper, a design half drawn, and tacked to the wall above it. In her grandfather's slow, careful hand was a tag, the cardboard gone brown and brittle. She leaned close and read it in the flashlight beam. For the next hand, it said, and under that, smaller, whoever it turns out to be. Della stood in front of the unfinished saddle for a long time. Then she sat down on the stool at the bench, the same stool her grandfather had sat on, and she put her flashlight on the bench top, and she looked at the room around her and tried to understand what she had been given. She did not, that first day, understand the half of it. The trouble was the same trouble it had always been, which was money. Della had a little put by, not much. The room she was renting south of here was going up at the first of the month, and she had told the man she could not pay it, which meant she had 3 weeks to find somewhere cheaper or somewhere else entirely. Her car had a noise in it she was afraid to have looked at. She had come up for her father's funeral with the vague, unspoken hope, the kind you are ashamed of even as you carry it, that there might be something. A little ground. A little money. Something that would let her stop bracing against the end of every month. And her brothers had given her a building. The pressure of it sat on her all that first week. She went back to the shop every day. She brought rags and a jug of water, and she cleaned a workbench she did not own a reason to clean, and she sat with the saddles. And she told herself she was being exactly what Russell had said she was, sentimental. A foolish woman fussing over an old man's leftovers while the clock ran out on her. Russell called her on the Thursday. He had a way of calling that was not really asking and not really telling, a tone their father had used. He said he understood she'd been driving out to the old place. He said there was no sense in her wearing out her car on that road, that the shop was a liability more than anything, the taxes and the chance of some kid burning it down or getting hurt in it, and the family getting sued. He said he'd been talking to Dean, and they thought the cleanest thing, since she was situated down south anyway, was for them to take the lot back off her hands. Keep it in the family. He named a figure. It was a few $1,000s. He said it the way a man says a thing he expects gratitude for. Della stood in the shop with the phone against her ear and looked at 11 saddles she did not yet have a value for, and one that her grandfather had left for the next hand, whoever it turned out to be, and something in her went still and certain in a way she had not felt in years. "Let me think about it," she said. "I want to look it over properly first." Russell did not like that. She could hear it. But he could not very well say so, not to a sister settling her own father's estate. So he told her to think it over quick, taxes being due, and he hung up. She put the phone in her pocket and she went back to the bench, and that was when she noticed the strongbox. It had been there all along, under the bench, pushed back against the wall in the shadow where her flashlight had not reached. An iron box about the size of a small trunk, heavy, with a hasp and a lock of its own. She dragged it out into the light. There was a tag wired to the handle, brown like the one on the saddle, in the same slow hand. "Papers," it said, "for the one who finds them." She tried the brass key from the padlock. It did not fit. She sat back on her heels and thought, and then she remembered the ring of old keys she'd found in the bottom drawer of her father's desk when she'd been going through his things, the keys nobody had been able to identify, that she had nearly thrown out and at the last minute had dropped in her coat pocket instead. She had them still. She fished them out. The third one she tried turned the lock. She did not open the box right away. She knelt there in front of it with her hand on the cold iron lid, and she found that her heart was going hard, and she did not entirely know why, except that her grandfather had labeled this box for the one who finds them, and across 60 years and a sealed door and a whole family that had stopped looking, she was the one who had found it. She lifted the lid. On top was a leather folder, soft and worn, and inside it a stack of paper covered edge to edge in her grandfather's writing. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. Columns, dates, names. It was a ledger. She turned the pages slowly. Every saddle he had ever made, going back to 1924, each one numbered and dated and described in his own hand. The tree, the rigging, the tooling pattern, the silver if there was any. The name of the man it was made for. The price he paid. Some of them had a second note beside them, a year and a word. Sold back, one said. Traded, said another. Returned, kept, said a third. And near the back, the last 11 entries, each one dated in the 1940s and 50s, each one with the same note beside it in a hand grown shakier with the years. Kept, not for sale. These were the 11 on the racks. He had made them, and he had kept them. He had never let them go. Under the ledger was the deed. It was folded in thirds, the paper heavy and yellowed, and when she opened it, she saw the recorder's stamp first, the county seal pressed into the corner with a date in 1949, and then the body of it in the formal language of such things. A conveyance. She read it twice before she understood, and when she understood, she read it a third time to be sure she was not making it up out of wanting it to be true. It was not a deed to the shop lot. Or rather, it was, but it was a deed to a great deal more than the shop lot. The legal description ran on for half a page, and her eye, untrained, snagged on it and slid off, but the words were plain enough where it mattered. Together with all that parcel lying along the east bank of Cottonwood Creek, the description said, and it gave the section and township numbers, and it described a long strip of bottomland running back from the shop's corner lot for the better part of a mile up the creek. And then a clause she had to read out loud to herself, alone in the cold shop, to make it real, together with all water rights appurtenant thereto. She did not yet know what that meant. But she knew the family story said Asa Vance had only ever had the shop and the half-acre under it, that he was a craftsman and not a landowner, that the ground along the creek had been bought up by Vernon for his cattle. And here was a deed, recorded in 1949 with the county seal on it, that said her grandfather had owned a mile of creek bottom and the water that went with it. 8 years before the family said he had nothing but a doomed trade and a building he locked up in grief. Under the deed was a second document, a certificate of a different kind, with a different seal, the state engineer's office, and a number, and a date she had to look at twice. The priority date on it was 1889. A water right with a priority date of 1889 on Cottonwood Creek, conveyed with the parcel, an ace of Vance's name, and then, by the deed above it, held with the shop and the bottom land as one indivisible piece of property. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. And at the bottom of the box, under all of it, was the letter. It was 3 pages, written in pencil on the same butcher paper as the saddle pattern, folded once, with her grandfather's name signed at the end and a date in the autumn of 1957, the same year he had locked the door. She unfolded it carefully because the paper was brittle at the creases, and she sat down on the stool with the afternoon light coming gray through the one chink in the boarded window, and she read what Ace of Vance had written to whoever would one day open his box. If you have got this far, he had written, then either I am a long time gone or somebody finally got their curiosity up, and either way I will say my piece plain, because plain is the only way I ever learned to say anything. I made every saddle in this room with my own 2 hands, and I will not say sorry for one of them. The trade went out from under me. That is nobody's fault, and it is not even anybody's meanness. It is only the way a thing goes when the world decides it is done with it. A man came through here selling rigs out of a wagon, machine-made and stamped to look like work, and the young fellows bought them because they did not know any better, and I do not hold it against them. A man buys what he can afford and what everybody else is buying. But I was not going to break up my shop and sell my life off for parts to people who could not tell a good tree from a bad one. So I shut the door. There are some who will say that was a foolish thing and a prideful thing, and maybe it was, but a man is allowed one prideful thing before he dies, and this is mine. The 11 saddles on the racks are the best I ever made, and they are kept here a purpose, because I would rather they sat in the dark and stayed what they are than go out into the world to be ruined by people who do not know what they are holding. If the one reading this is such a person, then put the sheets back over them and lock the door behind you and let them be. But if you are the other kind, the kind that looks close, that turns a thing over in your hand before you decide what it is worth, then they are yours, and so is everything else in this box. There is a deed in here for the ground along the creek and the water that runs with it. I took that land and that water in trade, honest, over 30 years, from men who had more creek bottom than cash and a need for a good saddle, and I recorded every bit of it proper at the courthouse, so there would be no question whose it was. My boy thinks I never owned anything but this shop. My boy thinks a lot of things. The water has a priority on it older than this whole county, and a day will come when that water is worth more than all the cattle that ever drank from that creek. And on that day, I would like it to belong to somebody who understands that the worth of a thing is not in how it looks from the road. I do not know who you will be. I cannot leave it to you by name because I do not know your name. And the law has its own ideas about such things that I am too old to fight. So I am doing the only thing I know how to do, which is to make it true and write it down and lock it up and trust that the right one comes and finds it. The next hand, whoever it turns out to be, whoever you are, finish the saddle. Ace of Vance. Della read it through, and then she sat for a long while and did not read anything at all. The light failed in the boarded window. Out behind the shop the creek ran the way it had run for 10,000 years, the way it had run when an old man traded saddles for the water in it, and the cottonwoods stood bare against the cold. She was the one who looks close. He had said it to her when she was a child, and he had written it to a stranger he would never meet. And they were the same person, and she had not known until this moment, on this stool, in this cold, that she had been waiting her whole life to be told that she was worth more than she looked from the road. She did not understand the deed and the water right well enough to know what they were worth. But she knew now that she was not going to sell anything back to her brother for a few $1,000s. She locked the box and the door, and she drove back into Hadley in the dark to find out what she actually had. The man who knew about saddles was named Wade Ostler, and it took her 2 days and a half-dozen phone calls to find him. He dealt in what he called Western Americana, old gear and old silver and the saddles of the men who had made them, out of a shop up in Elko, and he had a reputation among the people who knew such things as fair and as serious. When Della described what she'd found, 11 saddles in a sealed shop, a maker's ledger going back to 1924, the name A. Vance of Hadley, Ostler went silent on the phone for long enough that she thought the call had dropped. "You said Vance," he said finally. "A. Vance. Hadley. That's the mark," she said. "On the near jockey. My grandfather." "Ma'am," Ostler said, in the careful voice of a man stepping onto ground he is not sure will hold him. I'd like to drive down and see those saddles. Could I come tomorrow? He came the next morning in a clean truck and clean boots, a heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the gentle, deliberate movements of someone used to handling things that could not be replaced. Della led him into the shop, and he stopped in the doorway the way she had, took in the bench and the tools hung in their order, and she watched something move across his face that she recognized, because it was the thing she had felt. He walked the row of racks, and he did not touch anything for a long time. He just looked. When he finally drew back the muslin on the most heavily carved of the saddles, the silver-mounted one she'd thought must have been made only to be looked at, he made a sound low in his chest and took the reading glasses down off his forehead. He spent 3 hours with them. He turned each one over, found the mark on each near jockey, and matched it to the ledger entry. He photographed every saddle and every page of the ledger. He examined the silver, the rawhide braid on the horns, the cut of the tooling, with a loop and a small soft brush. He asked her questions about how they'd been stored and seemed almost unable to believe the answers. And when he was done, he sat down on a sawhorse and rubbed his face with both hands and was quiet for a moment before he spoke. I have been doing this for almost 40 years, he said. I have handled 3 Vance saddles in that time. 3. They come up maybe once a decade, and when one does, the collectors come out of the woodwork, and it doesn't go cheap. He looked down the row of racks. Your grandfather is not a name most people know, but the people who know. He was one of the great basin makers, on a level with the names everybody does know. And the reason he's not famous is the same reason these are sitting here. He didn't make many, and he didn't let go of the best ones. And then he shut his door, and the world forgot there'd been a saddle maker in Hadley at all. He shook his head slowly. There's 11 of them here, with his own ledger documenting every one. The provenance alone. He stopped and started again. Provenance is the whole game in this business. A saddle somebody says is a Vance is worth one thing. A saddle with the maker's own ledger entry, the date, the buyer, sitting in the maker's own shop with his own tools, is worth something else entirely. You have got the most completely documented body of one maker's work I have ever seen or expect to see. What's it worth? Della said. She had not meant to be so blunt, but the words came out plain, her grandfather's plainness. Osler told her. He did the saddles individually first, the way her father's appraiser had once gone through a list, the way a careful man gives a number he means to stand behind. The plainest of the working rigs, even the plainest, he put at several thousand. The middle ones higher. The heavily tooled, silver-mounted pieces he put at figures that made her sit down on the stool. And then he told her what the 11 together would bring, sold right, with the ledger, to the collectors and the auction houses and the museum people who would all want a piece of a story like this. And the number he said was larger than the appraised value of her father's whole estate. Larger than the house and the 10 acres and the grazing ground and the cattle, all of it, the things her brothers had divided between themselves at Coyle's table while they handed her the building. There's a museum up north would want first look at the whole collection, Osler said. Keep it together, keep the shop's story attached to it. They pay real money for the right thing, and this is the right thing. He glanced at the unfinished saddle on its tree at the end of the bench and did not say anything about it, and Della was glad. That one was not for sale, and she had already decided so. She walked him out to his truck and thanked him and said she would be in touch, and he stopped with his hand on the door and looked back at the silvered building with its rusted roof. From the road, he said, you'd never look twice at it. No, she said. You wouldn't. The deed and the water rights she took to a lawyer in the county seat, an hour east, a man named Hal Pruitt who did water work, because Coyle had told her, when she asked, that water rights were a specialty and not one he practiced. Pruitt was younger than she'd expected and sharper, and he read the deed and the certificate without a word, and then sat back and looked at her over the top of them. Where did you get these? He said. They were in my grandfather's shop. Recorded in 1949. Pruitt laid the deed flat on his desk and turned the certificate beside it and tapped the priority date with one finger. You understand what this is. I'm hoping you'll tell me. This, he said, is a senior water right on Cottonwood Creek with an 1889 priority date, appurtenant to a parcel of bottomland your grandfather owned outright and recorded clean. In this part of the world, water rights run by seniority. First in time, first in right. When the creek runs low, and out here the creek runs low more years than not, the senior rights get satisfied first, and the junior rights take what's left, if there's anything left. He turned the deed around so she could read the description. Your parcel, the shop, and this whole strip up the creek carries the senior right. The oldest call on that water in the entire drainage. He paused. Do you know who runs cattle on the ground downstream of you? Della looked at the legal description and the section and township numbers she still could not quite read, and she thought of her brother Dean, who had been given the grazing ground and the cattle, and her brother Russell, who had been given the home place, both of them watering off Cottonwood Creek the way the family had watered off it for 100 years. My brothers, she said. Pruitt nodded slowly, the way a man does when a thing has clicked into place. Then your brother's grazing operation waters underwrites junior to yours. Likely a good deal junior. Which means in a dry year, and we have had a string of dry years, the water your brother's cattle drink is water you have the senior right to. They've probably never known it. The way this parcel was held, separate, recorded, then sat on for 70 years, nobody'd have any reason to look. He sat back. Mrs. Vance, this right by itself, on the open market, leased or sold, is worth a great deal of money. There are operations and municipalities and developers in this state that pay 6 figures for senior water and consider it cheap. And it's yours. Recorded, clean, conveyed to you in the estate as part of this parcel. There's no question about it. It was your grandfather's, it passed to your father, and your father's estate deeded the parcel to you. Your name's on the recorder's books as of 2 weeks ago. My brothers gave me this parcel, Della said slowly, because they thought it was a worthless building and half an acre of weeds. They gave you, Pruitt said, the most valuable single piece of property in your family. By a wide margin. The shop's contents you'll want appraised separately, but this ground and this water, on its own, is worth more than the rest of the estate combined. A faint dry smile. It happens more than you'd think. People divide an estate by what they can see from the road. She heard her grandfather in it again. She seemed to hear him everywhere now. News travels in a place like Hadley the way water travels down a dry wash. Fast, and along channels you cannot see. Della had not told anyone, but Wade Osler had a man come down from the museum to look at the saddles, and the man stayed 2 nights at the only motel in town and asked questions at the cafe, and Gil Trabert, who was 84 and had buckarooed for 40 years and now sat most mornings at the feed store with his coffee, put the pieces together inside of a week. Gil came out to the shop on a Tuesday and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and his eyes wet, looking at the saddles on their racks. He had known Asa Vance. He had owned a Vance saddle himself once, the best thing he ever sat, sold it in a hard year, and regretted it ever since. He went down the row and Della watched an old man meet his own youth again, and when he got to the unfinished one on the tree, he read the tag, for the next hand, and he had to turn away for a minute. He shut this door the spring your daddy told him he was through with it, Gil said when he had himself back. I was there in town that day. Asa never said a word against the boy, not then, not ever. But he locked this place up, and that was the end of him. Really, the rest was just years. He looked at Della. He'd be glad it was you. You know that. The others never had the eye. You were the one used to sit with him. I was, Della said. Her brothers heard, of course. Russell called. First, and his tone had changed, the not asking gone careful and probing now. He'd heard there were some old saddles out there worth a little something. Was that right? And if so, it seemed to him they ought to talk as a family about how to handle it. Those being grandpas after all, family heirlooms. Maybe something they ought to share out fair among the 3 of them, since they'd all of them come down from Asa equal. Della listened to him. She had spent 58 years listening to her brothers explain to her what was fair. She let him finish. Russell, she said, 2 weeks ago you slid that deed across Coyle's table and you told me to sign, and you called me sentimental, and you and Dean kept the house and the ground and the cattle and the money, and you gave me a building you thought was full of rot. I signed it. You signed it. Coyle signed it. It's recorded. The shop is mine, and everything in it is mine, and the ground along the creek is mine, and the water is mine. She kept her voice level. There was no heat in it. She found she did not need any. I'm not going to fight you about it. I'm not even angry, not the way you'd think. But it's settled, and it's settled the way you settled it. You decided what everything was worth from the road. You don't get to come back and look closer now that it suits you. There was a long silence on the line. That water, Russell said finally, and she heard the thing underneath his voice now, the first real understanding of it. Della, Dean's whole operation runs off that creek. The home place, too. I know, she said. I've talked to a lawyer. I know exactly what I've got. She let that sit a moment, because he needed to feel it, the size of what he'd given away and the fact that she held it now. And then, because she was not Russell, and because she had sat with the old man and learned a different way of measuring things, she said the rest. And I'm not going to dry you out. I'm not him, and I'm not you. The water's mine, but you and Dean have got cattle that need it, and you've got it under junior rights that I could call on in a dry year if I wanted to be that kind of person, and I don't. So here's what I'll do. I'll lease you what you need, you and Dean both, at a fair price, in writing, through Pruitt, so there's never any question. You'll pay me for the water, because it's mine, and you'll know it's mine. But your cattle will drink. She paused. That's more than fair, and you know it's more than fair, and it's more than you'd have done for me. She could hear him breathing. Dean's whole operation, the home place, all of it, depending now on a lease from the sister they'd handed a ruin. All right, Russell said, and his voice was small. All right, Della. That's good of you. It's not good of me, she said. It's just fair. There's a difference. Grandpa knew it. I'm only sorry it took the rest of us so long. She hung up before he could find an answer. She did not sell all of the saddles. She thought hard about it, and in the end, she let the museum up north take 8 of them, the working rigs and a couple of the finer ones, on the terms Osler had brokered, and the money they paid changed the shape of her life the way real money does. She paid off her car, and she settled what she owed, and she stopped, for the first time in 30 years, bracing against the end of the month. The water she leased to her brothers through Pruitt, fair and in writing, and the lease alone brought in more every year than her father's cattle had cleared in a good one. The deed itself, the recorded conveyance with the county seal in the corner, she had framed, and she hung it on the wall of the shop above the bench where the south light fell on it. 3 of the saddles she kept. The plainest, because it was the one Gil said was most like the one he'd owned and lost, and she gave that one to Gil, who wept again and rode it exactly once, at 84, around the corral behind his place, and said it was the best thing he ever sat, same as the first time. And she kept the 2 most beautiful, the silver-mounted ones, because they were her grandfather showing the full reach of his hands, and she would not let them go into the world to hang on a collector's wall. They stayed in the shop, on their racks, in the south light. And she finished the saddle. Not all at once. It took her the better part of a year, evenings and weekends, because she had the eye but not the hands. Not yet, and there is no shortcut for the hands. She found an old saddle maker 2 valleys over, a man Ace's age who had known him slightly, and she paid him to teach her, and she went at it the way her grandfather had gone at everything, slow, refusing to let a thing leave the bench until it was right. She tooled the leather from the pattern he'd left half drawn on the butcher paper. She finished it. It was not as good as his. She knew that and did not mind it. It was a beginning, and a beginning made by hand is worth more than a perfect thing bought from a catalog, and she had her grandfather's word on that, framed on the wall. She moved up to Hadley for good. She lived in a little house in town, and she opened the shop 3 days a week, not as a business exactly, the trade being what it was, but as a place. People came. Ranchers brought tack to be mended that nobody else would touch. Young people came who had never known there'd been a saddle maker in Hadley and stood in the doorway the way she had, the way Osler had, the way Gil had, and breathed in the leather and the oil and looked at the 2 silver saddles in the light. She showed them, sometimes, how a stamp set true, how a thing made well sat different in the hand. She was the one who looked close, and now there were others learning too. What the paper had given her, in the end, was not only the money, though the money mattered and she would not pretend. Otherwise, it was the deed on the wall with her name on it where her father's father had meant her name to be all along, even though he could not write it there himself. It was being, after 58 years of being handed what others did not want, the rightful owner of the best thing her family ever made. It was proof, recorded and stamped and impossible to take back, that she had not been wrong to sit with the old man when no one else would, that the looking close had been worth something, that she had been worth something, all along, no matter how she appeared from the road. Her brother's cattle drank from Cottonwood Creek that whole dry summer, under a fair lease, paid for, in writing. and the water that ran past her grandfather's shop, the senior water with the oldest call in the drainage, ran clear and cold under the cottonwoods, the way it had run when an old saddle maker took it in trade and recorded it proper and locked it in an iron box for whoever would one day be the kind to come and find it. It turned out to be her. It had been going to be her the whole time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.